Hi everyone, and welcome to our video on the adrenal glands. This is part of our Module 5 series, and this is section 4 of Module 5 where we're looking at hormonal communication. What we're looking at in this video is specification reference 5.1.4b, the structure and function of the adrenal glands. First thing to remember then is that when we are talking about the adrenal glands, we are referring to one of those endocrine glands in the body that we looked at in our previous video. Now, these are ductless glands, which means they are going to release the hormones directly into the bloodstream, and the cells themselves that make up the endocrine gland are going to be manufacturing and releasing that hormone. When it comes to the location of the adrenal glands, then you need to just think where the kidneys are. And I always like to describe them as looking like little party hats sitting on top of the kidneys there. So basically they're just above or the anterior position on the kidneys. So we can see them in the little diagram on the left there. So the little yellow blobs sitting on top of the kidneys like little tiny party hats, those are the adrenal glands there. Now each of those adrenal glands is going to be divided up into two sections. We've got the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. One thing you've probably noticed about biology is we like the words cortex and medulla. They crop up all over the place. And we've just got to go careful that if you are referring to a particular organ, and we're talking about the cortex or the medulla, please make sure we're referring to the right thing. So if you are talking about the adrenal glands, clearly we should have the word adrenal in front of cortex and medulla. If we're talking about the kidneys, then that would have renal in front of it. Please don't mix them up. I know the word renal is in both, but it does change your answer quite a lot when you put renal when you meant adrenal, and you won't get the marks, trust me. So the cortex and the medulla. Cortex is around the outside, so these kind of regions here, and then the medulla is going to be the inner regions there. So medulla, think middle, and the cortex around the outside. The adrenal cortex is actually made up of these three distinct layers of cells. So the first one, the zona glomerulosa, is the outermost layer, and this is the one that's going to secrete these mineralocorticoids such as aldosterone. So that's a type of hormone. So the mineralocorticoids are a hormone type, and the example that we've got there is aldosterone. The second layer that we have is the zona fasciculata, and this is the middle layer, and this is going to be secreting glucocorticoids like cortisol. And then finally the zona reticularis, that's the innermost layer, and this is thought to secrete precursor molecules to the sex hormones. So your sex hormones being things like testosterone, etc. When it comes to the adrenal medulla, so that middle region of the adrenal glands, that will be secreting adrenaline and noradrenaline. So what we need to make sure we remember is which bits of the adrenal gland secrete what types of hormones and the examples. So it is worth just creating yourself a little flashcard on those so you can make sure you remember which bit of the adrenal gland produces what type of hormone and give yourself the example. Now, when it comes to the adrenal cortex, obviously we've mentioned a range of hormones there, and the thing they've got in common is that they use cholesterol. So this means that the hormones are actually steroid based. And if we think back to what we said in video 1 of this series, then we said that if they're steroid hormones, they are able to enter the cells. So the way these steroid hormones work then, they're going to pass through the plasma membrane of their target cells, and then that hormone can bind with a specific receptor in the cytoplasm of the cell itself. Once that's happened, we've got a receptor hormone complex because the receptor and the hormone have bound together, and that is able to enter the nucleus, and that's where it will bind with another receptor on the chromosomal material, the DNA. As a result of this, what we're going to find is mRNA production will be stimulated. So quite simply what we're seeing here is once that hormone has entered the cell, binds to a receptor found in the cytoplasm, that forms the receptor hormone complex that enters the nucleus, binds with another receptor on that DNA, and as a result of that binding, we get the stimulation of mRNA production. Let's have a look at some example hormones in more detail and what they're actually going to do. So, first of all, mineralocorticoids. So these are obviously the ones that are going to be secreted by that outermost layer of the adrenal cortex, that zona glomerulosa. And what we find is that these are all to do with controlling concentrations of sodium and potassium ions in the blood. Now, because these are all to do with controlling sodium and potassium ions in your blood, they are going to be involved in maintaining your blood pressure, because your blood pressure ties into obviously the water potential, and the water potential is affected by the concentrations of those ions. So the example of our mineralocorticoid is aldosterone, and this is going to act on the cells of your distal tubule, okay? So the DCT, distal convoluted tubule, in your kidney and the collecting ducts. So we're looking obviously at those last two sections of the kidney there, so the DCT and the collecting duct. What happens is, if that aldosterone is present, it's then going to lead to an increase in the amount of sodium ions that are being absorbed, and it decreases the absorption of the potassium ions. As a result of that, what we see is a greater amount of water is going to be retained within the blood, and because we've got a greater amount of water within the blood, that's going to increase the blood pressure. So we can see here how just having that hormone then leads to changes in the target cells, which are obviously located within the kidney, DCT and the collecting duct. We're going to change the amount of sodium and potassium ions that are being absorbed into the blood, and therefore change the amount of water present. The second example of a group of hormones that we are going to look at are the glucocorticoids. And remember, the glucocorticoids are the ones that are made still in the adrenal cortex, but in that layer called the zona fasciculata. Now, glucocorticoids are all to do with controlling the metabolism of carbohydrates, fats and proteins in the liver. So the example of our glucocorticoid is cortisol, and what we're going to find is that cortisol is going to be released in response to stress, or when your blood glucose concentration is low. So two kind of key situations there: stress response or low blood glucose concentration. Now obviously the cortisol is going to circulate round to the actual liver, where we've got those target cells. And as a result of coming into contact with those target cells, it is then going to cause that production of glucose from the stored compounds. So remember, the liver is all to do with storing these substances like glycogen, for example, which are all basically glucose reserves. So in that stress or low blood glucose concentration situation, we want more glucose in the bloodstream. Therefore, that cortisol having the effect on its target cells in the liver means we get a greater amount of glucose being released into the bloodstream. We may also find cortisol being released from the zona reticularis if we've got the correct enzymes being present. If the correct enzymes are not present, then instead we're going to release these things called precursor androgens. Now, the precursor androgens are then going to travel through the bloodstream down to whichever sex organ you happen to have, ovaries or testes, and there they will be converted into the sex hormones. Obviously, if we're talking testes, it would be testosterone. If we're talking the ovaries, then it would be things like the estrogen. The next hormone we need an example for is adrenaline. Now, adrenaline is a polar molecule which we derive from tyrosine, which is an amino acid. And the key thing about adrenaline is it cannot enter the cells itself. Therefore, it will bind to receptors on that cell surface membrane of the target cells. And the key thing to remember about adrenaline is it's quite widespread in its effects. Therefore, we've got a lot of cells scattered throughout the body that have those receptors for adrenaline, which means that when we have the adrenaline circulating in our bloodstream, then we will affect a range of different cells and tissues. And this is going to be really important. If we think about adrenaline, it is the fight or flight hormone, is the easiest way to think about it. So it's going to be released in times of particularly stress, where we may well be preparing to either fight or run away from a particular issue. So in order to achieve that, we need a range of different bits of our body working together to actually make it so that we can do either of those things. So what will adrenaline do? It's going to increase the heart rate, because if we've got an increased heart rate, that means we're going to be circulating a greater volume of blood in that same time frame. With a similar idea, it will increase the stroke volume of the heart as well. We're also going to see the smooth muscles in the bronchioles within your respiratory system being relaxed. That's obviously going to mean that the bronchioles are wider and therefore a greater volume of air can pass through them in the same time. We're going to see vasoconstriction occurring, and that's going to increase the blood pressure. And if we've got a higher blood pressure, it means that we're going to be able to supply those critical cells with our relevant materials in a short space of time. We're also going to see glycogen being converted back into glucose, necessary because glucose is required for respiration, and we're going to need ATP for a whole range of different things here. Our pupils will dilate in our eyes, and that obviously means that if our pupils are dilated, a greater amount of light can enter, and therefore hopefully you are going to have greater awareness of what's going on around you. You are going to have increased mental awareness, hopefully so your brain cells are working a little bit quicker to deal with whatever life may throw at you at that point in time. It also inhibits the action of your digestive system. Now that might seem a little bit strange, but the reality is the digestive system and what it's doing at that point in time is a bit irrelevant. We don't really care if we're digesting food at that point in time. We need our muscles to be ready to run or fight. So by inhibiting that gut action, we're able to then basically divert the blood to those critical parts of the body we need. And we will also have body hair standing on end or standing erect. Think about cats. They're probably the best example of this that you've probably seen. When a cat gets all wound up and things, it has adrenaline in its body. What does it do? It looks like a strange little puffy creature. Its tail is all puffy, its back stands on end, and then they start walking like oddballs as well, because cats can be a little bit strange, bless them. But that body hair standing on end is all to do with creating this bigger appearance to be more threatening. Obviously, as a tiny kitten, not really threatening, but bless them, they're trying. As always, I hope you found this video useful, and of course don't forget to subscribe to the channel so that you can see when any more videos are uploaded, and head on over to the website where you can find a range of other resources to help you in your A-level biology studies.